All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this, an IWI X95 Tavor, chambered in 5.56. Now, when we're talking about this, we are going to talk about a little bit of history. So, in the 1990s, the United States military would start supplying Israel surplus M16 rifles and carbines. And this would actually put the Israelis into an interesting position because it's not as though they lacked for rifles to begin with. They had already adopted and been utilizing for some years the Galil rifle family, of which they had an actually fairly lucrative export market going on with as well. Now, the Galil was an adaptation of the AK-47, kind of following along the same lines as a Valmet. And though successful, reliable, and all that, it was rather heavy. That was kind of the chief complaint, which is not surprising when you consider that it's a milled receiver AK-47 with some add-ons like bipods and stuff like that. The weight's only going to go up. So the M16 was received with much joy by the Israeli Defense Force, and they would wind up relegating the Galil to rear echelon in reserve type status while utilizing the M16 on their day-to-day operations. Now, this also put them in an interesting position, however, because this time around, when they decided to develop a new weapon system, they could actually really put some time and effort into developing something next generation instead of just an adaptation of weapon systems that are already lying around, or trying to more or less be on trend, but not necessarily forward-thinking or progressive in whatever it was that they were doing. So in the late 1990s, early 2000s, they would start working on a bullpup weapon system. Now, for those of you who don't know, a bullpup is a weapon system that has the receiver and magazine portion of the weapon system behind the pistol grip instead of directly in front of and above, as you would see on most common rifles. Now, there are quite a few advantages and disadvantages involved with bullpup rifles, and that could really fill a video on its own. However, one of the advantages of going with the bullpup is that you get a fairly short overall package with a longer barrel. This is a 16.5-inch barrel and a pretty trim, compact rifle overall. And that's really advantageous for CQB type situations, which the Israeli military frequently finds themselves in. So, the early 2000s, the Tavor assault rifle, or TAR-21, would make its appearance. This would be a 16.5-inch rifle. Now, of course, as we often find with Israeli weapon systems, there would be an entire family built around this designation. So we also have the CTAR, which is the carbine variant of the Tavor, which has a 15-inch barrel. We have the GTAR, which is the grenade launcher variant. We have the STAR 21, which is the designated marksman 18-inch barreled version, as well as the MTAR, which is the micro Tavor assault rifle. We'll get into that. We'll get into this more here in a second. Don't worry, we still have a little bit more history. Now, I will take this time to point out right now, guys, that if you're in a hurry or if I'm spending too much time on a particular subject, check the description, and there I'll have annotated where the video picks up at different times so that you can go ahead and jump ahead and get back to the things that you actually want to hear about instead of listening to me ramble through a rabbit hole of some sort. All right, now back to history. So, the TAR-21 would go into service along with its many variants and would actually also wind up on the export market as well. Now, some countries are producing the Tavor family under license, specifically Ukraine, which I found to be very interesting. Now, the Tavor would also be produced in 300 blackout. Newly produced Tavor rifles chambered in 5.56 come with 300 blackout springs. There's also a 9mm conversion kit out there and a 5.45 offering, which I bet you has a lot to do with production in Ukraine. Now, this would also eventually hit the civilian market, starting off in Canada as the SAR, which would be an 18-inch barreled rifle similar to the STAR, based on barrel length entirely, before it would make its way down to the United States in 2014 as, again, designated the SAR, but in a 16.5-inch barrel. Shortly thereafter, the X95 would also make its appearance in the United States, again with a 16.5-inch barrel. All right, guys, I think that pretty much brings us up to date on history. Not a whole lot to necessarily cover there. It's a fairly recent rifle, still in production. However, as I understand it, the Israelis are yet again moving away from a homegrown design and more towards M16s and M4s. Now, let's go ahead and talk about this particular rifle. So we have a 16.5-inch cold hammer forged 1-in-7 twist chrome lined barrel. At the end of this barrel, we have a A2 flash hider, which for most people, this is more or less a glorified thread protector. Most people will take this off and they'll go ahead and replace it with whatever muzzle device for suppressor host or whatever it is they want to make out of this weapon system. Now, of course, the actual MTAR, which the X95 is representation of, has a 13-inch barrel. Now, we also, on the X95 as opposed to the SAR, we get this quad handguard, this quad rail Picatinny handguard. Now on the SAR, you would have several smaller lengths of Picatinny rail placed around the forend here, and you would also have your charging handle out front. Here we just have this quad rail, which we can see is quite short. However, with the 13-inch barrel, this handguard's even shorter, so keep that in mind as well. Now the handguard comes with these covers on them, which are interesting because you have to keep this latch depressed the entire time in order to actually be able to remove the handguard. But what it gives you an interesting opportunity to do is run the handguards out some of the way so that you can try to get more of an aggressive grip, kind of that C-clamp grip that we see so commonly taught nowadays. Now, I did have this set up for a little while, but as I started to add more accessories around the rifle, I had to delete the handguards. And at that point, I might as well just stop using them in that way, which is what I did. Now on this side, we'll do a quick little embedded review for this Inforce WML. Now this is a 2-position setup with this little throw lever here, which allows me to select between constant on and momentary on, which I prefer to keep my lights on momentary on, just using them long enough in order to be able to expose the scene so that I can pick out what it is that I need to do. Now there's quite a few complaints about the Inforce lights. The first one centers around their battery life, which a lot of people have complaints that they seem to have a constant drain on the battery and that they run out quite frequently. I've had this battery in this light for a year now, and I've had no issues with battery life. But something that I do is whenever I have this rifle stored is I unscrew the bezel so that I'm for sure not putting a drain on the battery beyond what you would commonly find in the shelf life of the battery itself. Now, the other issue I hear a lot of people come up with is that these, being a plastic housing, are not terribly durable. And I do have to admit that I have those same kind of concerns. However, I do not run my lights into like doorways or bounce them off boulders or anything like that, so it's not really something that I've had an issue with so far. It is something I'm keeping an eye out for, and I'll update you guys as I move along. One of the things that I do like about having a plastic housing, however, is that it's lightweight, and it does help me keep a light, trim rifle overall. Now, in addition to that, we do have this little fence right here, which is super nice for making sure that I don't accidentally initiate the light whenever it is that I'm not wanting to, guarding me against light negligent discharges. Now, originally, I had this light on top of the handguard so that I could try to have an ambidextrous setup. However, this handguard, as you can see, is quite fat, and it's a lot of reach to get all the way up to the light itself. As well as when I put it on the top rail, that means that I cover up the front sight that is recessed into the top of the Picatinny rail. So I then lose the use of my front sight, which means that I lose my backup sights. And if you guys have seen my video on tactical rifle setup, that's not okay with me. So I moved it over to this side. I can still kind of reach it. I do have to reach under the light in order to be able to get around to it, but it is not inaccessible to me. And I still have the use of my front sight. Now the front sight does have a tritium insert into it. You'll notice that it is quite tall and skinny for a front sight, and it falls in completely flush with the rails. You wouldn't even know it was there if I hadn't told you. We'll talk more about the iron sights before we're done here. Now on the bottom, I have a stubby grip that I made by modifying a grip pod. I've never been a big fan of the grip pods, but I had quite a few of them lying around that I had absolutely no money invested in. So I decided to go ahead and cut them to a length that is actually useful to me. So I've actually found this pretty handy in helping keep the rifle seated on my shoulder and all that kind of stuff, especially since it being so compact and not necessarily having a lot of handguard to begin with. It is nice to have something out here to be able to anchor and press against. All right, let's go ahead and talk about this optic real quick. This is a Seymour TRW, which is one of their tactical rail cover lights. Now, for those of you who are not as familiar with them, Seymour has actually made a name for itself in competition pistol shooting. They've been a longtime favorite on many race guns that competitors have been using for years. Now, you get quite a few interesting options with the Seymour sights. They're actually surprisingly customizable. There's quite a few different models out there, and I can actually change the size of the dot by changing out this emitter diode. Right now, I have this set up for a 4 MOA dot, and I can get it in 2 MOA, 8 MOA, 16 MOA, whatever it is that I want to mount on this, in this emitter position, which they're color-coded, all this type of stuff. Now, this Optic has been interesting to me, and there's a couple of things that I really like about it and a couple of things that I don't. It's another little embedded review here, but one of the things that I like about the Optic is that, especially shooting with both eyes open, it's very thin and very trim overall profile, which allows me to be able to observe a lot of what's going on while also still being able to see my sight, which is really fantastic as far as field of view whenever we're talking about, like, compared to an EOTech, where an EOTech has a lot of field of view, but it also has a large housing that goes around the Optic itself that can kind of be a little bit obstructive to observing impacts or perhaps being as aware of your surroundings. This is much thinner in overall profile. However, the other thing about EOTech housings is that they've got a big bulky housing that protects the Optic, and this feels much more exposed. This is also of a plastic construction, which is great for being lightweight, but it leaves something to be desired in terms of durability. Now, once again, I'm not beating this against walls, but it is something that I'm concerned about for fighting type applications, in that I start to really question its durability. So this is something that I will probably wind up swapping out at some point in the future. Now, this also does take a 1/3 N-type battery, which is unfortunate because they're rather expensive and not nearly as easy to find as AA's, AAA's, or even lithium 123s. However, the battery life is amazing, to where I still have the original battery that this came with in this rifle. It's not even shown an inkling of needing to slow down. I had one more complaint. This will be the last thing that I have to say about this Optic for now. It would be making adjustments on it. This rifle, it takes 3 different tools to loosen the capture screws and then also make the adjustments for windage and elevation. And I find that incredibly irritating. And I would have much preferred it to have been a little bit more streamlined. In addition to that, just like on our potentiometer for adjusting brightness, there are no clicks on windage or elevation. Now, I don't mind it for adjusting brightness because I just keep turning the dial to the dots, the brightness that I want. But on this, it's a little bit more irritating. It didn't take me very long to zero it. My guesstimations were fairly accurate. However, that's just it. I had to work off of guesstimations. So that's like a little... It's like a little irritation for me. It's not a big deal, it's just something that I noticed. All right, back to the review. Now, into our forend on either side, we have QD cups. When we come back to this position here, we have more QD cups. On this side of the rifle, we will notice that we have a charging handle, which has been moved to the center line of the rifle as opposed to the SAR's forward mounting charging handle. It has a little bit of a forward sweep to it, which makes it really easy to hook your hand against, and it is non-reciprocating. Now, our magazine release is also located directly above the trigger guard. It is ambidextrous. The charging handle can also be swapped sides. And we'll just go ahead and get out of the way now, your direction of ejection can also be changed. However, that does take tools. Now, we also have our fire selector right above the pistol grip, safe and semi. This can be reversed as well. Now, I do prefer this button-type magazine release as being very akin to an AR-15 and different from the SAR's release, which was actually right in front of the magazine well. All right, our trigger guard is this large D-shape trigger guard, which I have to say that I'm not a terribly big fan of, and we'll get into that here in just a little bit. You can swap out this module, however, for a more traditional style trigger guard, which is more akin to what you would see in Israeli service. Now, this trigger, a lot of people will have a tendency to complain about triggers in bullpups because you have a linkage that connects the trigger to the actual firing mechanism in the rear of the rifle. Surprisingly enough, that might make things feel a little weird, spongy, cringy, stagey type of deal. I have no real complaints about this trigger, but it's not surprising to me that somebody would, just based off of work, having an action up here have some sort of impact on an action back here. It's kind of like trying to flip a light switch with a broomstick. It's not necessarily hard to do. It would definitely just be a lot easier if your finger was directly connected to the light switch at that point instead of trying to do it at a distance with a stick. So, type of deal there. Anyway, so our rear sight is also set down into the rail, and again is very tall, has a bit of a tombstone type appearance to it. Kind of reminds me of an FN FAL rear sight. All right, so our ejection port on this rifle is located on the right side. Let me pop this pin real quick. And our bolt and operating system is a long stroke gas piston. Now, something that I find really interesting about this rifle is that we have dual ejectors placed into the bolt face. And this is something that I most commonly associate with like AR-10s. But I'm curious as to whether or not this has some sort of impact on the ejection process as far as direction is concerned. One of the issues with bullpups, obviously, is that the ejection port is well back into your workspace. And if you're a left-handed firer or shooting with your left hand for some reason, and the ejection port is still set up on the right side of the gun, you're potentially going to start eating brass, and this is a definite concern. So quite a few different manufacturers have used different methods to try to impact that dynamic. The Keltec RFB, there we go, rifle forward ejecting, uses a chute that actually causes the casings to be ejected forward and exit out the front of the gun. That is a method that's been used. I think IWI is trying to use those dual ejectors to try to get the timing just right to not necessarily have the ejection coming back into your chest if you're shooting off of this side. We'll talk about that more here in a little bit. Now, we can see here, I have my crappy bungee sling attached to this particular rifle. These QD sling swivels actually came with the rifle along with the cleaning kit. And then we have our magwell, which has worked just fine with all Stanag magazines, Magpols, PMags, the steel GI mags, all that type of stuff. And I assume you would be able to fit drums into this. However, with how you wind up being on top of the rifle, I also think a drum magazine would kind of get in your way. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but do whatever makes you happy. Now, back here, we have this lever, which is our bolt release, which is quite spacious and easy to get your hands on, which I'm going to try to mitigate the microphone freaking out on me. So it is very spacious, very easy to get a hold of, which is kind of a problem if you're just at the range hanging out and you set it down. Sometimes it's pretty easy to bump that button by accident, but it's also a fairly easy thing to correct. And then we have our rather spacious butt pad here at the end. All right, guys, so there's our features. How does it shoot? All right, well, this thing has had a little bit of a rough history with me. When I first got this rifle, I just had the iron sights on it, and I had it on it for quite a while. I've had this rifle for quite a few years. And I actually almost got rid of it because of these iron sights. My issue with these iron sights is how tall they are, and they are not captive. There's no button to press in order to be able to lower them. And with how tall they are, I have an increased concern that they're potentially going to snag against something and fall into the rifle. And the problem with that is they're not that easy to pull back out. You kind of got to search around for them in order to be able to find the actual tab that pulls them up out of the rifle. So it's really great that they're so flush fit and low profile, but it's also very difficult to get them back into action. And you know, I don't have a requirement that I have to have locking folding sights. I'm completely fine with like Magpul and bus sights, just the standard plastic setups. Because at the very least they're spring loaded. So if it does get knocked over, yeah, that sucks. It's gonna kind of disrupt me a little bit, but at the very least all I have to do is get my thumb back out there, activate that switch, and then it's back into the game. In addition to that, they're also a little bit more low profile. Just by these existing in this format, there's like a 200% increase in the probability that I'm going to knock these things over when I probably wouldn't do it with any other rifle. It's just how I evaluate that overall. In addition, I do not like that only the front sight has the tritium insert. I wish the rear sights did as well. Pretty much every other Israeli designed rifle has front and rear lithium sights, tritium sights, excuse me. Why does this one not? Why did they decide to cut the requirement here? Now, I do have this set up for absolute code witness. And one of my other issues with the sighting system is that it feels so indistinct. I think some of the issue might be that I'm like directly on top of the rear sight, which this is a peep type rear sight and a post type front sight. This is a front sight or a sight arrangement that I historically have really liked and advocated for. Yet, I used to shoot 5 MOA groups with this rifle, and I had trouble impacting 8-inch steel circles at 200 yards with these sights. I couldn't get it to connect. And I really feel like it's just too much. There's too much space. The front sight is a tad too large, and I never really connected with them. However, once I got this 4 MOA red dot on here, everything came together and I started shooting a lot better groupings with this rifle. I started actually being able to hit all the way out to 400 with this rifle, and it actually became viable for me, and I stopped considering selling it at that point. Now, there's also quite a few other things we got to talk about with handling, but let's go ahead and cover the nitty-gritty accuracy aspect of it. So, I've gone out here recently with ammo costs and all that kind of stuff, guys. I've been shooting a lot of Tula ammunition. So the paper target that I had to show you today is a 4 MOA group with Tula 55 grain FMJ. Now, if I'm being completely honest with you, that's generally what this rifle shoots. Now, there's a couple things we got to take into account with that. This is a 1-in-7 twist barrel. It will stabilize 55 grain ammunition. It just doesn't necessarily love 55 grain ammunition. We won't necessarily get the best accuracy out of it. But in this case, that's okay, because in my opinion, 4 MOA is minute of man, is my minimum requirement for the accuracy out of a fighting type rifle. This isn't a precision rifle, this is a fighting rifle. I'm completely fine with 4 MOA. It does exactly what I need it to do. Now, I'm sure if I put a magnified optic on this rifle and some 77 grain OTMs in it, I would get just absolutely amazing accuracy. But keep in mind that accuracy has been one of the chief complaints with the Tavor. There's actually quite a few videos out on YouTube about the accuracy issues with the Tavor. Some people have gone so far as to remove this plastic insert around the barrel right here in order to try to free float it some, and it's had mixed results on actually helping out. For my purposes, with a 16-inch barrel and 55 grain ammunition, this rifle's doing exactly what I need it to do. I have no complaints. I'm sure if you spend enough time looking around, someone with a combination of ammunition, shooter, and optic has been able to turn in a 1 MOA group. It's just not me. And on this channel, we evaluate rifles based off of how we would actually take them into battle, not whether or not they turn in 1 MOA groups with super high powered optics on top of them and ammunition that I can't afford to stock. because unfortunately with the cost of 77 grain ammunition, trying to have 55 grain and 77 grain on hand is like stocking two completely different calibers. And I just don't have the interest when I can go ahead and put in a simple refinement of still stabilized ammunition with 55 grain ammo in this rifle. All right, now let's talk about a couple of other aspects with it, specifically with some dynamic type manipulations. So I've actually taken this rifle into 2 different competitions now. And there's a couple of things that I've noticed. So first off, whenever we're doing cross-shoulder type transitions, whenever you're working around cover or perhaps doing some CQB type stuff, and you want to make sure that as you pie corners, you're not exposing too much of yourself. This rifle is a little weird to try to do it with. So, a couple of things. Where do you grab on this rifle in order to be able to punch out whenever it is that you do the shoulder transition? Because this is actually going to play a big part in the remainder of the video. When you're doing this with an AR-15, it's a little easier. Now keep in mind, guys, I have trained around the AR-15 platform my entire adult life, both personally and professionally. But, so, when I am crossing shoulders with my AR-15, I will swim out of my sling, grab the front of the magazine well, punch forward, and then cross it over to my other shoulder so that I can then grab up my pistol grip and get back to work. That's all very easy to do because of how the balance on this rifle is laid out, which, by the way, this is my LWRC M6 IC A5, previously reviewed on the channel. However, trying to do that same thing with this rifle is not as easy. Trying to grab out far. So you could try to do it off of like your pistol grip or something like that, but that you're in a bad relationship with the overall length of the rifle. Also, you have a balance preference towards the rear of the rifle because that's where the receiver's at. So what I found to be easiest is to grab the front portion here in front of the trigger guard, right around my magazine release, punch forward, and cross it over. And one of the important aspects there being is to remember that I have the sling tensioned so that I don't have to swim out of it. We'll talk about that more here in a bit. So then get back to work. However, one of the key things to keep in mind when you're doing that is that you have your magazine release here as well as your trigger. And there's a lot of space for your hand to potentially come in contact with that trigger. And if you're not on safe when that happens, you might discharge the rifle. That's not a good thing, don't do that. Now, in addition to that, if you press too hard on your magazine release, you might drop your magazine and then you're just gonna look kind of silly. So that's something that requires a little bit of training and practice, something to consider overall. Now, this ejection path, you do need to be worried about that, especially if you're a left-handed shooter or if you're shooting left-handed. Now, when I first got this rifle, the wife and I took it to the range, and she is left-handed. And she unfortunately did not make a good choice in range attire and had a low-cut blouse on. And a hot shell casing went down that low-cut blouse, and she now has a burn scar, and I get a lot of glares because of it, especially whenever this rifle comes out. So spare yourselves that. Keep an eye out on your significant other's range attire when you go to the range. Now, I most recently burnt myself on this rifle just this last weekend when I was competing with it, and I was very surprised by that. So what happened was I was stacked up on a barrier. I did the initial portion of the engagement and then transitioned a little sloppily because I forgot I didn't have to swim out of my sling. I transitioned over to my left side, and I think I was a tad too far forward on the rifle, a little too scrunched up, and wound up having every ejected round thud into my chin.
Stand by.
So I came away with 4 burn marks because of that. Something to consider with this rifle, that you do still have the suggestion port back here, and it will bite you if you let it. Now, something else that I've noticed, and that is magazine changes. Now, guys, again, with having trained around AR-15s, what I am used to doing, what I have been continually trained on for years and have continued to train, are workspace reloads. So I rotate up into workspace, hit, magazine release gets hit at some point during that, might have to strip a mag, might have to shake it a little bit in order to get it out, and then feed in my next magazine, release my bolt, get back into work. And that way, I have the magazine well in my kind of visual space. I can still kind of look around, see what's going on while I diagnose a malfunction or reload my rifle so I can get back to work. I can still be threat oriented or scanning for threats while working on my rifle. That's a little bit more difficult to do with this rifle, because when I rotate up into workspace, I'm looking at this section. I don't have my magazine in my face. I'd have to bring the rifle up in order to do that. That's a little bit more strain on the arm that's not really required. So something that I've been moving towards with this rifle specifically, but I'm also seeing taught more and more often in schools now, is to reload off of my shoulder. So one of the great things about that is I can go ahead and drop that mag. I can make a fairly quick glance at whatever it is that's going on with the rifle, still be able to observe what's going on around me, and then reload and get back to work. And that's also really great because it works with the balance point of the rifle instead of trying to strain against it. So I keep it tagged into my body, which actually, as far as how this rifle balances, it's very easy to hold this to the shoulder with one hand. So like if this arm is injured, I would still be able to effectively fight like this. Not optimally, but well enough to be able to get myself out of whatever situation that I'm in. Now, also, whenever you're talking about doing reloads with the Tavor, what IWI tells you to do is that you should make like a beer can thumbs up grip on your magazine. So that way, as your magazine gets seated, you come in contact with the bolt release, which then gets you right back into the game. Now, one of the things that's really important to keep in mind about this is that it's kind of like whenever you're doing a slide release reload on a handgun. So great, magazine comes up into the handgun and then I release the slide and I'm back into work, right? Well, if your hands are moving at 2 different speeds, you might not have that magazine seated yet when you release your slide, and then you don't have a round in the chamber. That's potentially a problem when you come up on your target, be it paper or human. In order to guard against the same type of event with this rifle, what I do is I grip the front of the magazine, I ram it into the magazine well, give it a quick tug, and then bring my thumb around in order to hit the bolt release so I get back into work. That way I know for sure the magazine is seated before I try to go back to fighting. All right, guys, that's a lot of my thoughts and opinions around working around the Tavor. That's one of the reasons that I like keeping it around, is that it makes me reevaluate what it is that I'm doing, not just because this rifle is so different, because obviously I'm still, when push comes to shove, probably going to wind up fighting with an AR-15, especially professionally. However, it makes me reevaluate stuff that I hold to be true with an AR-15 and see if it still works here, and if maybe that refinement carries over to the AR-15. That's what I call training strange. It makes me reevaluate what I'm doing, really think about it critically, and analyze whether or not I need to change things up in order to have a smoother, more repeatable practice. All right, so with this being the case, what is this rifle to me? Well, guys, this is actually a truck gun for me, because we have an incredibly compact rifle that still has a 16-inch barrel. So it's not an NFA item, it's not an AR pistol or anything like that. This is a full-on rifle, which is what makes it so interesting in comparison to something like an AR-15, because, I'll go ahead and stack the stocks against each other. we can see that the Tavor is drastically shorter than even a fully collapsed AR-15. That's one of the things that I love about this rifle and what makes it a consistent choice for me for travel or anytime that I need a truck gun. Which also, this short overall size makes this thing a CQB monster. It is so easy to pie corners with this rifle and be able to work around extremely tight spaces. Like my house has a lot of tight corners, a lot of really stacked up tight corners. And that makes pieing them with a larger weapon system whenever I'm clearing the house, you know, because I got asked to clear the house type of deals. It makes it very difficult to be able to pie those corners and see what it is that's going on without exposing myself prematurely. This rifle takes care of that. I love it for that. Now, what are my long-term goals for this rifle? Well, at some point, guys, I do want to make this more IDF correct. So at some point, I will SBR it, and I'll put a 13-inch barrel in, because why not? I'll put on the shorter handguard. I'll put in the more traditional styled trigger guard, and I will definitely swap this optic out for something that is more Israeli spec. Not because I have to, but because I want to, because that's what I think the appeal of this rifle is be able to make it part of my militaria collection by replicating an IDF rifle. Now, what do I recommend you guys do with a rifle like this? Well, I think the biggest appeal this rifle will have are to people who are tired of the AR-15 or who have very limited interest in the AR-15 because it's too mainstream. Which is a factor. I can totally understand not wanting to have the same rifle as everybody else. I enjoy running this rifle because it is so different and it really makes me have to work through the problem, and I appreciate that. Now, I think an ideal candidate for this rifle would be somebody who's coming off of an AK-47. And as much as they like the AK, they want something that's a little bit more readily adaptable to different types of accessories and optics and all that kind of stuff. Maybe runs on a more available AR-15 magazine, but isn't an AR-15. That's where I think this rifle will come in. The manual of arms is just a little bit easier than your average AK, which would be a massive boost to a guy who's used to running an AK, who's used to having something a little bit more complicated. This will be just a tad bit more streamlined, and I think they'll still get a lot of options that they don't get in the AK with these rails, that they don't have to, you know, do some sort of modification to a rail in order to get it to really fit their particular AK. Or they have these more or less flush Picatinny rails that are easier for them to mount optics on as opposed to the side rail AK type mounts, or a lot of the other like Ultimac rails and all that kind of stuff that are of questionable stability, or perhaps have some longevity concerns depending on what optic it is that you use. This rifle is going to kind of beat them out in that regard. So, something for you guys to consider overall. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular rifle. I hope you guys found this review interesting, and have a good day.